Thank you, everyone, for coming to another Disability Futurity seminar. I'm Ryan Patterson, Project Director of the series with the Carleton University Disability Research Group, in collaboration with Professor David Bolt and Professor Claire Penketh, who's here with us today at the Liverpool Hope University Center for Culture and Disability Studies. And today we're lucky to have three outstanding disability studies scholars. Dr. Beth Robertson with the Conference Board of Canada and the Carleton University Disability Research Group. Dr. Gildas Bregain with the École des Hautes Études en Santé Publique, and Dr. Paul van Trigt with Leiden University. And using several historical case studies, our speakers are going to ask how nation states define, imagine, and respond to disability, or how they don't, and how relationships between disability and the state manifest in society through history. And since most of you are muted, please visually join me by clapping in front of the camera in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning or this afternoon, from everyone joining us from the EU and UK. I'm going to share my screen, and you can let me know if you don't see it.
We see it.
Perfect. Okay. So my case study, I have named a ridiculously long title, but essentially intersections of disability and technology in the context of displacement, post-World War II case study of forced migration, citizenship, and persons who are blind. Up on the screen, you'll see an image of one of the people who I'll be talking about, called Gamrat. And he is laughing and chatting with Clara Langerhans, an American foundation, a person from the American Foundation for the Blind, who was interviewing him at the time to possibly be resettled into the US. Canada ended up getting him, just as a spoiler. But to begin, I want to start with a bit of context, and hopefully this will provide a bit of context for the upcoming speakers as well. At this very moment, there are 79.5 million, so close to 80 million people displaced persons around the globe today, with 26 million classified as refugees. And this number only seems to be growing. The UNHCR Refugee Agency estimates that 34,000 more people are forcibly displaced every day. Migrants are forced to leave their homes for a variety of reasons, whether escaping war, violence, persecution, and now natural disasters as a result of climate change. People with disabilities face a number of additional challenges and barriers. And in addition to these barriers, challenges, risks can frequently be physical, but societal and cultural attitudes that systemically discriminate against people with disabilities are also very prominent obstacles. One type of those kind of the interaction between the physical and those societal norms that I'll be speaking about today are specific technologies, particularly the camera as well as the X-ray, and how they can all too often intersect with the societal and cultural attitudes with varying consequences of lives of refugees with disabilities. Today, I'll be focusing on an era that is frequently viewed, although perhaps not as accurately viewed, as I'm sure Gildas will elaborate, as the beginning of this current day global refugee crisis, when the numbers of displaced people were significantly lower than they are today. A total of 11 million people had been displaced as a result of the conflict of World War II. By 1947, that number had dropped to 850,000 people. And these individuals occupied a number of displaced persons camps across Europe, as well as elsewhere. Now, these people continue to be a cause of grave concern, according to international authorities, that prompted an international effort to, as one person put it, to achieve permanent solution for refugees. In the early 50s, it was shocking that so many people had lived in these camps for up to 5 years. Again, this may seem like a meager number, considering now that people can reside in refugee camps or more generally live in exile from their home countries anywhere from 5 to 30 years, and sometimes even longer still. The historic origins of these current day statistics is nonetheless important to examine more closely, not only to get a sense of like, how did we get here, but also to investigate why certain demographics were and continue to be at much higher risk of ongoing insecurity, violence, exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion by the state in the context of displacement. For the purpose of today, my aim is to at least tentatively probe how the vectors of disability, technology, and notions of desirable national citizenship can and have collided in the context of displacement through the story of a small group of displaced persons who were blind or partially sighted and primarily in the year 1950. I just put up on the screen another image of two men who I'll talk about in more depth. And it's titled Blinds in Neustadt. And that is the title that I would not choose, but has been the title that you will find in the UN archives at this moment. So people with disabilities were among the millions of people displaced by the violence and ongoing political turmoil of the Second World War and its aftermath, a fact recognized by the International Refugee Organization, or the IRO. The IRO was an intergovernmental agency established in 1946 to address the massive crisis of displaced peoples coming out of Europe after the Second World War. Now, governments had faced forced migrations in the past, of course, and a typical approach had been to repatriate individuals back to where they had come from once hostilities had ceased, even if against their will. But the IRO emerged from the growing international conviction that people had a right to flee violence and find safe haven away from home. And this sentiment would eventually find a place in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The formation of the IRO in turn led to a more formal recognition of refugee as a legitimate status of an individual based on persecution or fear of persecution, whether it be due to one's race, faith, nationality, or political affiliation. Initially imagined to be a short-term organization, the IRO would later be transformed into the United Nations High Commissioner for the refugees that exist to this day. From 1947 to the end of 1949, the IRO resettled approximately 675,000 people, the vast majority of whom were deemed as, and I quote, presenting no special problems in health, age, skills, or family composition. According to a 1950 IRO bulletin, however, the IRO was faced with an impossible deadline in 1950 all the same. Charles T. Rayner, who was then the IRO chief of the Office of Public Information for the IRO, described it in this way. In less than 6 months, the IRO must close down a care and maintenance program that at its peak fed, housed, and clothed more than 1/3 displaced persons, and in less than 15 months must assist in the resettlement or repatriation of as many as possible of the displaced persons still remaining. Now, there was one group of individuals who remained perhaps especially of concern to the IRO in 1950. These individuals were residing in an old U-boat training center turned displaced persons camp in Neustadt, Germany. The group of individuals from all across Eastern Europe had gained some attention, not only because they were all blind or partially sighted, but also how they began to help one another. And now this image on the screen that I promised I would describe to you is of two men, Pavolis Zuka, who is Lithuanian, and Olgerts David, who is Latvian. And the label of this photograph in the archive reads, Davis, a graduate of the University of Riga, has been blind for many years. He has a high school teaching diploma. He teaches other blind persons in German, English, music, history, geography, and other high school subjects. Some of the students are studying for their high school diplomas. Here he is teaching Pavolis to read Braille. Pavolis says each word out loud as he goes along. Davis knows all the books by heart. Both are totally blind. Davis and Zuka were not the only ones, or as was described more generally by the IRO, and I quote, in the former U-boat training camp at Neustadt, Germany on the Baltic Sea, blind refugees under IRO care have pooled their learning and trades training to set up their own rehabilitation program. Now, despite the determination and initiative of these individuals who took collective action to improve their chances for resettlement, they remained at the camp nonetheless. And to remedy this challenge, the IRO obviously used the camera and photography strategically to advertise the individuals left behind, so to speak. The use of photography by humanitarian organizations has been very well studied. Well, notably, what may make these photographs somewhat unique is that rather than rely on commonly used tropes of victimhood and suffering, these people were positioned as capable, eager, and able to contribute economically and socially to whatever nation that would accept them. The visual positioning was important to ensure that these men and women were perceived as potential citizens by demonstrating the opposite of stereotypical understandings of disability as dependent and incapable. In the end, however, it would only serve as the beginning of a much longer process. And I've switched the slides to entitled Special Action, Negotiation, Selection, and Inadmissibility. It has an image of one of these documents that were considered during the selection process by the CNIB and Canadian Immigration Authorities, including a picture of a man who may not look blind, but he is partially sighted, with his child and wife. So in the spring of 1950, the IRO reached out to the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or the CNIB, a now 30-year-old organization at that time, to see if they might assist in helping resettle displaced people who were blind within Canada. IRO's statistics as of February 1950 calculated that there were 419 people accounted for who were blind or partially sighted, still living in British-administered camps, much like the one at Neustadt, not only across Germany, but also Austria and Italy. And this was 5 years after the war had come to an end. Up to that time, Norway had been the only country that expressed willingness to take in any of these individuals, agreeing to resettle 100 individuals and up to 100 of their family members. The IRO offered to provide a grant of $650 for each individual who was blind and $250 for each of their family members. The CNI agreed, with the help of the IRO and the American Foundation for Overseas Blind in Paris, France, to help resettle 10 individuals and their dependents. To begin this long process of resettlement, the first step of the IRO and CNIB was to approach the Canadian immigration officials in May of 1950, as people who were blind were typically considered inadmissible under Canadian immigration legislation and could only come to Canada if afforded special action on the part of official authorities. In May of 1950, Hector Allard, who is the head of the IRO Quebec office, wrote to Edwin Baker, who is the managing director of the CNIB, with whom he had previously corresponded about resettlement. Allard reflected on a meeting that he had a few days before with the Deputy Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, reporting back that, as he put it, the Canadian immigration authorities are anxious to have assurance that blind displaced persons and their dependents brought into Canada by the Institute will not become public charges. To quell fears that these individuals would impose undue strain on health or social services, Allard assured Fortier that these people would be duly supported by the CNIB, and perhaps most importantly, would be carefully selected so as to be in a position to be at least partly self-dependent because of their skills. Now, what this meant was that in order to appease the state, individuals would not be assessed or selected on need, but on their perceived ability to be productive and compliant workers and citizens, able to contribute actively to the growing post-war economy and infrastructure. And to prove they would do so, these selected individuals would have to undergo intense scrutiny, including a series of medical exams using X-ray technology and other monitoring systems. Now, when agreeing to help resettle these 10 displaced people, the CNIB entrusted Eric Bolter with the selection. Now, Bolter was the Assistant European Director of the American Foundation for Overseas Blinds. To help guide Bolter, the CNIB offered him a set of stipulations that they felt would appease Canadian immigration authorities. CNIB's sponsorship meant that these migrants' blindness would not be considered a medical factor, barring them from resettling within Canada. So Baker, therefore, did not list stipulations that fell under the category of health, but focused on perceived employability. An April 1950 letter between Edwin Baker and Bolter reads that preferably candidates would be, and I quote, adults between the ages of 21 and 50, that they should have at least some working knowledge of English or French, and finally, that they should preferably have some skill or craft, or if not trained, then intelligence and aptitude coupled with ambition to make a new life. When the language requirement proved to be too difficult to meet, the CNIB adjusted their request to individuals who could speak German, or people whom the IRO offered language instruction while at the camps. The IRO, asking the CNIB to be generous and flexible, responded by inquiring into other possible reasons for refugees' exclusion from the sponsorship program. They asked the CNIB whether they would take someone with an illness or parallel handicaps, as they put it, or someone who had become blind due to a sexually transmitted disease, or venereal disease, as it was then, or VD, as it was then called. The IRO's refocus on health largely reflected how the organization tended to classify people who were blind within their own resettlement program. A list drawn up by IRO officials that same year of certain groups requiring resettlement lumped people who were blind together with people who had tuberculosis, were chronically ill, mental cases as it was described, as well as children of any of these groups. Edwin Baker replied to the IRO that they would not exclude anyone based on the cause of their blindness, including VD, or sexually transmitted diseases. As for parallel handicaps, he agreed to accept individuals with a non-life-threatening and temporary illness that would not, as he put it, constitute a serious or complete obstruction to any reasonable rehabilitation. Baker drew the line, however, with anyone who had what he called cancer or active tuberculosis or some other active progressive condition. The CNIB would not necessarily object to people with multiple disabilities, but this did not extend to cognitive or mental disabilities. Baker explained that they could not accept people who were, as he described, low intelligence or with irrational conditions, as Baker and his colleagues assumed that otherwise the CNIB would not be able to meet the demands of Canadian immigration authorities that insisted that everyone accepted for resettlement be employable. These strict standards stipulated by the Canadian immigration also led to the exclusion of disabled women. Notably, Baker initially stated that the CNIB had no preference as to gender, yet overseas workers facilitated the selection on the CNIB's behalf did not choose a single blind woman for resettlement, unless she were listed as a dependent of the primary person, who is always male. Mary Clark, who is the director of the CNIB Department of Welfare, explained this choice a few years later to women requesting resettlement. Clark wrote that CNIB, again, was limited by the employability demands of Canadian immigration authorities. It is not so easy to secure work for blind women, she wrote. And for that reason, we have been unable to include any women in the group. We take direct responsibility. Now, I put on the screen the title Medical Technology and Exclusion. It includes an image of two individuals who I will again be talking about, as well as an X-ray machine that I have that was used in this era in these camps, but was not actually. I have no proof that this was the actual machine, but it gives you an example of what kind of apparatus they would have in the camps themselves. This is an X-ray machine that's held in the Ingenium Museum's collections. So Bolter identified 28 men as possible candidates between August and December 1950. Although the target was 10, of this pool of individuals, only 8 men and their families received approval by Canadian immigration once it was confirmed that they were in good health. And many of the others were deemed inadmissible or detained for long periods. Christopus Jenkis and his cited sister Els Jenkis, who are up on the screen, were originally from Lithuania. They had fled the country in an attempt to escape the occupying regimes of the Germans and the Soviets, whose violence had left approximately 1 million Lithuanians dead by the end of the war. Many other displaced people had been safely relocated elsewhere by this time. Yet the brother and sister were still living in British-controlled Neustadt camp in Germany by 1950, when IRO officials interviewed them for possible resettlement to Canada with CNIB sponsorship. The Jenkins family had originally been high up on the priority list put together by the CNIB because they know a little bit of English. Jenkins was also a skilled basket maker. But they were delayed repeatedly over Canadian medical officials' objections regarding their health, even though these precise concerns were never clearly explained. Officials seemed particularly preoccupied with Christopus, whom they subjected to multiple x-rays and exams. As a result, Jenkins and his sister were not included within the initial 8 families to come to Canada. The Jenkins family succeeded later in overcoming the multiple hurdles placed in their way. They arrived eventually in Canada close to a year later with the CNIB support. The reason for Jenkins dependence, or the reason for Jenkins detainment and others are generally ambiguous outside of a general reference to concerns over health. Now, due to CNB's sponsorship, they were not to be deemed inadmissible on account of their blindness, but even this did not seem to stop medical officials from excessively scrutinizing their bodies through rigorous and repeated application of medical technologies like the X-ray. Now, a visualizing technology, much like the camera, the X-ray was in contrast used as a means to exclude those who were too often characterized as sick, despite attempts to present them otherwise. And I've just changed the slide to entitled Resettlement and the Conditions of Citizenship. Again, it contains a lineup of individuals and one man in particular with a white cane and his dog, which I'll speak about shortly. So in the early morning hours of January 18th, 1951, 8 of the first men sponsored by the CNIB arrived with their families at the Montreal airport. Journalist Frank Lowe of the Montreal Daily Star reported the arrival of the group in glowing terms, writing, "In an age when other countries have practically closed their doors to newcomers from Europe, no matter how sound and wind or limb, Canada has welcomed them and promised them a chance to earn a living." Now, this article and others highlighted a selection of individual stories while providing some rich photographic material, including these photographs up on the screen that depict men and women lined up before the camera after coming off the plane. Karol Gamrot, a Polish man along with his wife Mariana and 5-year-old daughter Leona, initially caught the attention of the press due to their service dog, who may have struck people as a bit unusual. This service dog named Uta, also up on the screen, was a German Shepherd. And she enthusiastically greeted Gamrot after being released from cargo storage. Lowe briefly outlined Gamrot's story, explaining that Gamrot had been a forced laborer in a Nazi concentration camp in Poland. He had lost his vision after being given poisoned alcohol by his German captors, presumably to test the effects of the substance. The other newly arrived migrants were frequently described as war veterans who had lost their sight in the battlefields, even if this were not the case. Now, the rhetoric, if misleading, emphasized the legitimacy of these migrants' claim to resettle in Canada. It would seem a right to life and asylum as stipulated by the UN's Declaration of Human Rights were not enough at this time to justify their coming to Canada. Rather, these individuals, through invention and photography, yet again, needed to be presented as worthy of citizenship due to their patriotism, even if their disabilities signaled to immigration officials and others that they were not. So in conclusion, I've put on another slide that says conclusion. It has a number of other images of people who were at that camp in Neustadt, Germany, including a man looking kind of vacantly off the side of the camera holding a cigarette while being scrutinized by a man behind him with suit and tie, as well as another man surrounded by his daughters and wife by a Braille writer, apparently learning how to use it. So today I've examined a case study involving a small group of refugees with disabilities that demonstrates, I think anyway, a much broader understanding of how disability is consistently positioned as antithetical to citizenship, how the presence of people with disabilities within the confines of the nation state need to be subsequently justified, especially when the context of displacement and resettlement. The fact that these technologies like the photograph and the X-ray were used to help determine such positioning and justification in reference to these individuals who can never see or access the visual products of these technologies is more than telling. And with that, I will end and pass it over to Gildas.
And I will speak about the comparison of national disability policy through the prism of transnational flow and the specific case of Argentina, Spain, and Algeria. I apologize for my English, which is quite poor. So I am convinced that in order to understand the specificity of the national disability policy, it's necessary to take into account international standards on disability, but also the spectrum of ideas promoted by transnational networks, because ideas from abroad are appropriated by local associative and administrative actors. From my point of view, international texts are means of regulating the utopias of associative actors. These texts legitimized certain rights, but concealed others' rights. So I have tried in my research to explain the construction of national disability policies in 3 countries, taking into account 2 factors. First, the influence of international bodies, international standards on transnational flows of ideas, materials, and people, and the influence of national associative mobilization. We have to take into account the successful experiences, but also the failure of this mobilization. So it allowed me to identify the convergence and divergence of these national policies in various countries. I used some international archives and national administrative archives, on associative archives, on interviews, on associative reviews also. So I have made historical timelines which shows the non-linearity of social conquest for the right of people with disability at international level. So one aim of my research is to show how the transnational advocacy networks manage to obtain the adoption of international text which legitimate the right of disabled people. And during the first part of the 20th century, we have two really big elements. We have the adoption in 1923 by the International Labour Organization of recommendation of experts who affirm that to ensure the durable placement of the invalids in the work market, it was essential to have recourse to the legal obligation of employment of invalids. That is to say that this recommendation legitimates the quota system. And a decade later, the League of Nations Child Welfare Committee approved a resolution in April 1932, which guaranteed the right to education for blind children. And this resolution guaranteed the right for special education. So it legitimated the teaching of the braille in special school, while at the same time, there were other alternative systems, like the teaching of the blind children with the sighted children in the public council schools in France, for example, and the teaching of the blind children in the Quranic schools in the Arab countries. So it's a way of regulating the utopias. And during the same period, the Child Welfare Committee refused to study immediately the question of the crippled children, the feeble-minded children, and the deaf children, because they had more urgent questions. And I have seen that there is a very big change after World War II, with a shift toward economic liberalization in the international disability policies. So in the middle of the 1950s, the United States, the representative of other capitalist countries, and the employers' representatives succeeded in shifting international policies on vocational rehabilitation towards a more liberal economic policy. The ILO recommendation number 99 legitimated the exercise of a paid professional activity in the context of a liberal market economy. It institutionalized the selective placement of disabled workers in a competitive work market and symbolically depreciated the use of compulsory employment quotas by submitting its adoption to specific conditions and by drowning it in a high number of different possible measures. This recommendation excluded less productive disabled workers from ordinary work placement and expected them to work in sheltered workshops as freelance workers, or condemned them to the absence of a remunerated activity. During the 1970s, we can see that there is a mass media diffusion of the idea of disability rights by NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. And each sector, like the blind, the deaf, the parent of mentally handicapped children, want to have an international declaration which could guarantee their specific rights. And it's only the parents of mentally retarded children who managed to obtain a specific declaration which guarantee the right of their children. And this declaration of the United Nations does not recognize the right to marry or to have children for the mentally retarded person. And 4 years later, in 1975, the United Nations approved the Declaration of the Right of Disabled Person. And this declaration confirms the equalization of the right of all categories of persons with disability. But this declaration does not recognize the right to accessibility, for example. And with this declaration, the United Nations become an institution which promotes rights for disabled people, but not guarantee this right. This declaration of the United Nations have not any binding effect. So I will speak now about the evolution of international disability policy during the 20th century. Schematically, it can be considered that international disability policies were inspired by the European experience of the rehabilitation of war-disabled people during the 1920s, with the promotion of the idea of compulsory employment quotas for war-disabled people in public administration and private companies. And if we map the countries members of the NGOs working for the cause of the war-disabled, we can see that only a small number of countries are represented, mostly from continental Europe. On the contrary, at the beginning of the 1950s, these policies were inspired by the Anglo-Saxon and Nordic experiences in the field of rehabilitation. This international policy is characterized by the unification and coordination of sectoral disability policy, the equalization of the right of different categories of people with disability, and a shift toward economic liberalization in the vocational rehabilitation policy. So I drew a map to identify the founding countries of what I call the North Atlantic Project of Rehabilitation Modernization in the 1950s. And these countries are in red in the map. The Anglo-Saxon countries and Nordic countries are among the founding members of the International Federation of Physical Medicine, the World Federation of Occupational Therapy, the World Confederation of Physical Therapy. These countries developed a policy of selective placement of disabled people, and most of these countries were represented as the Stoke-Mandeville Games in 1953. And the core of this North Atlantic Rehabilitation Project is formed by the Anglo-Saxon countries. And what we see is that during the 1970s, there was a plurality of rehabilitation modernization projects, as the North Atlantic Rehabilitation Project experienced several failures. As a result, international organizations such as the International Labour Organization or the World Health Organization or the United Nations promoted other models of rehabilitation based on socialist experiences, such as disability cooperatives, for example, or based on the experiences of developing countries with simplified rehabilitation in agriculture or simplified rehabilitation in sheltered workshop. And these changes in international disability policies shift the focus of the North Atlantic Project of Rehabilitation to the Nordic countries, because the Nordic countries have much more collaborative links with socialist countries and with developing countries during the 70s. Now I will speak about the transnational flows and the influence of European North Atlantic and socialist projects on the construction of national disability policies in Argentina, Spain, and Algeria. In Argentina and Spain, we can see that doctors are very quickly becoming part of the European rehabilitation networks during the interwar period. The Spanish and Argentinian doctors are members of the International Association of Physical Medicine and Physiotherapy and the International Society of Orthopedic Surgery and Traumatology. They made several trips to Italy, Austria, and Germany, during which they become aware of European ideas on the rehabilitation of who are disabled people. On their return to their countries, they defended the idea of obligatory employment of the disabled in private companies and public administration, the setting up of rehabilitation schools, and the free delivery of prostheses. The case is very different in Algeria because it was the colonial period, so many actors regularly traveled to the French metropolis, like blind students, blind associative leaders who are disabled, nurses, teachers, doctors. So they appropriate the ideas defended by the actors in the French metropolis. So there is a very big change during the 1950s. From the 1950s onwards, the intervention of international organizations changed the orientation of national disability policy. The World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, and the United Nations provided technical assistance to the countries like Argentina, Algeria, and Spain, sending experts in vocational rehabilitation and offering scholarship for specialization in rehabilitation. The technical assistance distributed by international agencies is not homogeneous at the international level, but it's multifaceted. The technical assistance provided to Latin American countries and Spain is very much inspired by the experiences of Anglo-Saxon and Nordic countries, and therefore has an economic liberal orientation. Conversely, when this technical assistance is provided to a socialist countries like Algeria, it is much more complex, drawing on the experience of European, socialist, and to a lesser extent, Anglo-Saxon countries. So I have drawn a map of the movement of experts sent by the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the ILO to Argentina, Brazil, and Spain during the 1950s and 1960s, and of the fellowships holders financed by these international bodies. There is an enormous consistency in this circulation. The UN, the ILO, and the WHO experts are almost all from Anglo-Saxon and Nordic countries, and fellows are almost always sent to Anglo-Saxon or Nordic countries for further training in the field of rehabilitation during the 1950s and 60s. The ILO experts sent in Latin America advised the governments against the adoption of legislation on the compulsory employment of rehabilitated disabled workers in private companies. They also encourage local actors to accept the liberal principles of professional integration of the disabled, like the idea of selective placement, the rejection of the quota system for private company, and the utility of sheltered workshop. Conversely, in the case of Argentina, it can be seen that the movements are much more complex. International organizations sent 2 Yugoslav physiotherapists and a Polish physiatrist and an English occupational therapist to Algeria, which at this moment was a socialist government. And that explains the link with socialist countries. And Algerian fellows of the World Health Organization are sent to France and Switzerland to specialize in vocational rehabilitation because of their mastery of French and their lack of knowledge of English. So we can identify various national trajectory of disability policy. In Argentina and Spain, we can see a similar trajectory, but very strong differences in the influence of the European project of rehabilitation modernization on the North Atlantic rehabilitation project. In both countries, we see that there is a partial convergence of these policies around certain North Atlantic inspired international standards, like the creation of the specialties of occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and rehabilitation medicine, and the creation of a model national rehabilitation institute on a national scale. However, we can see that Spain, which had developed a rehabilitation policy strongly inspired by European rehabilitation projects, has difficulties in applying the North Atlantic Rehabilitation Project. In fact, as several sectorial policies had been developed in favor of the war disabled, of the blind, of the injured workers, the coordination of sectoral disability policies was very complicated during the 1960s and 70s because each ministry refused to lose its autonomy of action. Moreover, due to the autarky of the Franco regime and the lack of union freedom in Spain, the country did not benefit from any technical assistance mission in vocational rehabilitation until the 70s. The trajectory of disability policy in Algeria is far more complex due to the preexistence of very strong traditional Muslim practice of assistance to the blind and cripples, and due to the socialist orientation of the independent government. And what characterized Algeria until recently is the fact that the blind have managed to maintain during a very long time the specificity of the right granted, and have remained central actors in disability policies with the war disabled. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. Great that I can present my research here. And I will do that under the title Human Rights, an Unknown Disability History and the Future of the Nation State. Let's see how, yeah, this works. What I present today is part of my the book I'm working on, and that is a book about the history of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCPD, and its history. So at the moment, Gildas ends his story. I will start. So in the late 1960s, I start with the moment that people for the first time framed disability as a human rights issue at a global level. And I follow that trajectory towards the UNCPD in 2006. But today I will have a more narrow focus, and I was inspired by the title of the seminar that speaks about the futures of nations, of the nation. And I that started my thinking, and I started rereading Hannah Arendt and her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And there is a very interesting chapter in that with the title, The Decline of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man. And I think in that chapter, she makes very clear that the nation state is very important and relevant for human rights, and that human rights are often understood as citizen rights, because a nation state can guarantee, can protect the rights of its citizens. But on the other hand, she makes clear that human rights are in a way very vulnerable if there is no nation state and no institution that can guarantee and protect the rights of people. And she is making that point, especially in the discussion about refugees and the rights of asylum. But I think it's a more general insight, also useful in the case of disability. I come back to Arendt, because I think today there are much more human rights treaties, much more institutions that can guarantee, that can protect human rights. If you compare it to the moment Arendt was writing in the early 1950s. And we see, for instance, in the late 70s that the UN adopted a special treaty for the rights of women. Late 80s, the rights of children, migrant workers in 1990. So today there is, at least on paper, much more protection. And there are also bodies that monitor these treaties. So from that perspective, you could ask, is it not late that the UNCPD was only realized, adopted in 2006? And were the 1990s not an era in which you would expect that a treaty on disability was realized? Because two reasons. The 1990s in general, I think, are an era of globalization with a lot of attention to human rights. So, for instance, the Human Rights Commissioner in Geneva was appointed. And I think, there's a lot of attention for developing the international world order, and people combine that often with talking about the decline of the nation state, because we are all global citizens. Another development that is relevant in relation to this is the human rights lobby since the 1980s, especially by Disabled People International, so the first NGO at the global level run by disabled people themselves. They already in the 1980s started a lobby for the human rights perspective on disability at a global level. And since the late 1980s, they started the lobby for a convention. So I was wondering in my research why no international law on disability in the 1990s. And I will show you how I will explain that. And I think my explanation is a historical explanation. And of course, there are several things to mention when you want to explain something, but I want to focus in particular on what I found in the archives of the Secretary General. Because there I found a correspondence that I think gave me insight in a sort of alternative approach to disability. And what I mean with alternative is an alternative for the human rights approach. So I was familiar with the human rights approach, as brought to the fore by organizations like Disabled People International, but I was not aware of this alternative approach so much. And let me explain what I mean with this approach. When you investigate the archives of the Secretary General, and in particular how the Secretary General relates himself to disability policies, then it's interesting what happens in the late 1980s and in the 1990s, because what I just said, Disabled People International started to push the idea of a convention, and there was an official UN expert meeting in the late 1980s. DPI was involved there, but also other NGOs and UN experts. And one of the main recommendations of that expert meeting was to start the drafting of a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And if you read the response of the staff of the Secretary General at that moment, Perez de Cuellar, then one of the staff members is writing about that recommendation, and I quote, "As you can see, they are quite far-reaching. The problem is that if all implemented, they would have financial and administrative implications for the UN." So the Secretary General is very reluctant to the drafting of a convention, and in general is reluctant to certain NGOs and certain actors in the field of disability. So I've given another quote from one of the leaders of DPI, Joshua Malenga, in the early 90s. Then he's writing that, or he is saying that during a meeting with the Secretary General in the 1990s, and he is complaining, and I quote him, "One frustration that NGOs had was the layers of hierarchy in the United Nations. That day was the first time that they were in direct contact with the Secretary General." So for a long time, they tried to have contact with the Secretary General, and that was very difficult. Then the alternative approach and alternative actors, and there you see a very different story and a very different image. And that is something you only discover if you delve into the archives, and because in the stories about the history of the convention, you never read about people like Alan Reich, and I found a lot of stuff produced by this man and his organization. And he was really developing during the 1980s a diplomatic relationship with the Secretary General. And as become clear from the first quote he gave here, he was very positive about the approach of the UN to disability, as long as they approach disability as a social and a humanitarian issue. So he was not against human rights, and he was hardly writing about human rights, but it was clear that he was in favor of what I called the sort of social development approach of disability. And that means that you do not approach disability in the first place as a human rights issue, but as an issue of a social issue and a humanitarian issue. And he was successful in developing the relationship, and one of the outcomes of that relationship with the Secretary General was the so-called Franklin Roosevelt International Disability award that he realized in the 1990s, and it was given to countries that, according to the criteria of that award, were making progress in disability policies. And the striking thing is that they refer back to the World Programme of Action concerning disabled persons as adopted by the UN in the early 1980s. So he was ignoring all the human rights recommendations. Also, in the early 1990s, there was a non-binding agreement on the rights of persons with disability. He was ignoring all that stuff and still trying to bring disability to the fore as an issue of social development, and successful in that. For instance, in the collaboration with the Secretary General in the case of this award. So what you see if you try to understand what the social development approach is about, that you see that the word rights is ignored, and that is that language as the same opportunities as other citizens. That is a sort of the dominant language if you read papers from the social development perspective. And what you see there is what I think is a less radical understanding of equality than the human rights perspective that was brought to the fore by Disabled People International and other organizations. And what also is, I think, very interesting, and then we come slightly back to the nation state, that that disability, when it's, so to say, parked in the box of social development and humanitarian affairs, that's to a large extent it's parked in the box of the voluntary sphere and at a safe distance of state policies and the political debate about state policies. And I think this is important to notice if you want to understand the development of the human rights perspective at the international level, because the human rights approach, or the human rights law approach, as developed by Disabled People International and activist scholars like Theresia Degner, you see that in their thinking, the nation state plays an important role in implementing human rights policies and in paying for these policies. So public funding is seen as an important part of the human rights law approach, instead of the social development approach, in which non-state actors such as NGOs and business companies were seen as very important. And that is also what you see in Alan Reich's diplomacy, that he's constantly sort of mentioning his business contacts, and especially during the 1990s, the Secretary General is very, very interested in that. And so that's a sort of the ideal position of the human rights approach. What human rights activists such as Theresia Degner also experienced in practice, that at the UN level, the Commission for Social Development, that was sort of the leading unit at the UN in disability policies, attracted less attention than the Commission on human rights. So by parking disability in the social development box, and making the Commission for Social Development responsible for disability policies, disability remains a marginal issue at the UN level. And I think activist scholars such as Theresa Degner have tried during the 1990s to change that, but they were only successful during the negotiations of the UN Convention, because it's very interesting to see that at the beginning of the negotiations of the UN, it was still unclear if the convention would become a human rights treaty or a social development treaty or policy document. So let's conclude my presentation. So I tend to say that following Arendt, that the nation state is in a way essential for human rights, although universal human rights suggests something else. I think it was exactly the reason, or at least one of the main reasons, that the lobby for the convention in the 1990s was not successful, because the nation state would come with political debate and with public funding, and that were seen as obstacles during the 1990s. Let's see what I. Yeah, I think in the histories until now, the histories of the convention, it's not really highlighted that there were forces like Ellen Reich against the development of international law. So I think that helps our understanding of the trajectory of the UNCPD, and makes also clear that the UNCPD is not a sort of logical outcome of history. And I think you could interpret this story as making clear that also the success of the UNCPD will depend on how we frame the nation state, and which role we will give the nation state in the implementation of the UNCPD. Thanks for your attention.
All right, everyone, I see there's I've never known there was a clapping emoji. Okay, through whatever method you like, I'm going to visually show, everyone, round of applause through some method for, I'm seeing for our speakers, please. Realizing it's happening while I'm talking. Thank you very much, all three of you. The only downside to having three wonderful speakers is it leaves a little bit less time for questions than we would otherwise like. But I know the posted time for this event said 11. We can actually go a little long, but if anyone needs to drop out, obviously feel free and justified to do so if anyone has plans at 11. But recognizing that we could go a little longer than that, I'm just going to open the floor. If anyone has a question, we can't unmute you, so you're going to have you'd have to unmute your feed, and just I'm going to go silent, and feel free to introduce yourself and ask a question, please. Okay, I'll start. I'm still unmuted. Okay, yeah, that's a good thing to check. I wonder if, with the national versus international, at some level, how you treat disability is at the national level, you'd think it's somewhat based on the idea of the citizen, whereas international, there's that concept of universal human rights. And because those are slightly different things, I wonder if any of you, Beth's example will be, like, all of your answers will be specific to time period. Are they always the same in the sense that, sorry, I'll reword that. Is a country that is really well involved in international disability rights, disability development. On the international scale, does it one-to-one tend to be the states that are really good domestically? Or do we have cases that you've encountered of a state that doesn't really take care of its own too much, but for some reason participates in the UN, or has really good programs at home, but isn't interested in the international scale? Or do they tend to come together?
Ryan, in some ways I'll jump in here. This can be considered a subjective opinion. I would say Canada is a really good example of a country that is very involved with the UN and at least likes to present itself internationally, is very good on human rights and very good programs, but domestically and especially historically, it has not been the case. The case study I was talking about, it kind of illustrates that kind of tension between these international policies, like the UN Declaration of Human Rights versus Canadian immigration legislation that basically bars people from entering their country if they don't meet certain criteria. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, also a difficult one, because I think almost for every country it's very interesting to investigate. I think the US I think Canada is indeed a very interesting example, and I saw already in the chat also the reference to the role of Canada in Disabled People International, and I think one of my colleagues in Leiden is focusing on the Canadian self-advocacy and how they work together with diplomats, but that's another story. The US, I think, is an interesting example also, because they were at the international level against human rights. Disability human rights, especially when it was used in the sense of human rights law. But the American with Disabilities Act is I think all over the world seen as one of the most important anti-discrimination laws when it comes to disability. So there it is the other way around, that there was progress, domestic progress, but at the international level there was no progress at all. But it's very interesting to compare sort of domestic policies with international policies. That's also there is a nice book written about how the situation in the Netherlands is, and that the title is Rights for Others. So that's human rights were seen as right for others. So the Dutch are fighting for human rights at the international level, pointing to countries that doing a bad job with human rights. But if you, for instance, investigate the human rights policies concerning disability, it's disaster in the Netherlands, really.
Yeah, I agree totally with Paul. It's very complex, and I think that for every country we could see a dark face of the country, and so I have no affirmative answer to this.
Thank you, everyone. Open floor again.
May I ask a question to Paul? Because you said that the United States were against the disability human rights. I don't know if you can develop a little bit this. Thank you.
Yeah, and of course I have to nuance that a bit, because it's interesting. Alan Reicht, so the person I mentioned, was from the United States, working together with U.S. diplomats. So in that sense, the U.S. was active in disability policies, but into a certain direction. So they were very positive about global disability policies when it remains a social, the social development approach, but they were against everything that has to do with human rights law concerning people with disabilities. So, for instance, already in the late 1980s, first Sweden, then Italy proposed to start the drafting of a convention, and the US was one of the countries against that. And throughout the 1990s, and I think still they have not ratified the UNCPD, but that's also a sort of general thing in case of the US, because they hardly ratify UN treaties on human rights.
And even during the 1950s, the US didn't want any convention on rehabilitation. They want only recommendation with no binding effects. So just that.
Christina, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, I asked my question, but I know both Gildas and Paul. So, yeah, I'm a researcher now. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in disability studies, also in inclusive education. And I did my research in France, and now at the moment I'm in Germany, so I try to explore a little bit what's going on in Germany. But I come more from sociology, so I'm not really a historian, but I think the two disciplines are quite well related. So.
Great, thanks very much. Welcome. Good to meet you. Anyone else?
I can jump in here if that's okay. I was just wondering, I thought it was really interesting when Dr. Robertson was talking about the idea that the way that how somebody acquired a disability could have influenced whether they were allowed to come in, and sort of these narratives of the veteran and that. And so I'm just wondering from the three speakers if this notion that maybe some people with disabilities are more deserving than other people is something that came up for you.
For me, in the countries, in the South countries I have studied, like Latin American countries or North African countries, the blind have a very special status and very special rights, but because they mobilized themselves very strongly during the interwar periods. So they conquest some rights before the others, and sometimes they just fight in order to manage that the other category of disabled people didn't conquest any rights, like in Spain, for example, where the blind have the right of have some right to sell some les coupons, like lottery tickets, and they didn't want any other categories to benefit of these lottery tickets.
Yeah. It depends on the case. I have two things in mind. I'm still surprised by the fact that the first declaration was about mentally retarded persons. That was the term they used at the time. So that's very interesting to see that it started with that group, but it take a long time before that group became really involved themselves, because the declaration was designed by parents. So it started with that group, but very late the people with mental disabilities became involved in UN policies. The deaf case, the deaf community and their involvement at a global level is also a very interesting one, because they follow in a way sort of separate trajectory. And they, in some cases, during the negotiations about the convention, they were very late sort of integrated in discussions, for instance, about special education. But there is not, in the UN sources I investigate, I do not really see the language of deserving and less and more deserving. So you see differences and also the power play between the different groups, but not really that specific language.
Can I jump in and respond to that very good question, Alicia? Yeah, I think it really, Paul, your point about it being very dependent on the situation. And that's what's interesting, I think, about these kind of international comparisons. It's very culturally embedded. But in North America, the idea of a veteran, of someone, it fuels this idea of pure patriotism. That it was the veterans who really led the charge in terms of advancing disability rights, and particularly for those who were blind, but for other disabilities as well. But what this meant was that a number of other individuals were sidelined. And so the fact, and I point to women, for instance, right, there's a kind of constant characterization of people with disabilities as children or passive or effeminate, lacking manhood. And so the worthy person with disability is a man who is patriotic, who has fought in a war, who has fought the Nazis, that kind of idea. Even if it's like in the case that I was bringing up, for the most part, it was almost entirely fictional. I don't think there was a single veteran who was brought to Canada in that group of individuals. There is a story as well about, in terms of the kinds of disabilities and acquired disabilities as well, about that also reflects kind of gendered norms and around that. A story that I didn't get into very much, but there was three sisters who were, and two of them were blind, but one of them was not. And she was a very strong advocate, and she almost broke that gender line, it seemed, in terms of, however, then it was revealed that she had a mental health disability, and they were immediately cut off the list. And it was never specified if she had acquired the mental health disability while being displaced or due to violence or war or whatever. It was just that fact alone was enough to completely disqualify them, even though they had proved that they were skilled. They had advanced language skills. Anyway. So it is an interesting and very situational and contextual, of course. But that I would say that definitely comes into play, even if it doesn't transcribe into official documents. It definitely happens a lot on the ground.
Thank you.
Hi, I just have a kind of general question that could go to all the speakers, because I'm in a class for human rights and I'm focusing on disability in particular and the way in which those rights were implemented within Canada. And I think the thing I'm running into is a lot of disability, the definition, I mean, obviously just changes over time as when more people get into participating and also want to see their own rights valued. So I guess I wanted to ask on the international level, when people come to bat for disability, it's usually around collective rights. And I think we see a lot of individual participants, like blind groups and deaf groups come and argue their rights individually. But I guess how is this, would you say this like collective understanding of disability and this definition can be inhibiting in like implementing it through internationally disability rights?
I have seen that the blind was the unique example of a collective which reivindicated during the 1960s declaration for all categories of disabled people, whereas all other categories revendicated an international declaration for the right of their specific categories. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I'm not so well into the discussions about the definition. Now the UNCPD is there and it's implemented and worked with. So, but I know about the negotiations that it was a very conscious choice to not define disability. But I think in several articles, you can you can find all the negotiations and the notes of the negotiations on the UN website. So for instance, special education, there was a lot of discussion about how, because special education in a way is important for the deaf community, and most of the other groups with disabilities want to highlight inclusion in normal education, so to say. So there you see how they deal with the different groups and the different definitions, and that's for several articles the case. But they, of course, often the question is asked why, or what is disability and how should we define it. But in the case of the UNCPD, they have decided we don't want to define disability. So and there is now a special committee on the human rights of people with disabilities, and probably they have meanwhile already written about this, how to handle this. But that's I can imagine that you can find something there, but that's what I can say now.
Thank you.
Do our three speakers have any questions for each other? You don't have to. Okay, if I don't, oh, hey, Paul.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but I was thinking which question I would ask. Yes, I was wondering, Gildas, about I think it was very nice to see the sort of Northern Atlantic projects of rehabilitation. Is it possible to write that history also more from below and with more attention to the voices of the Global South, for instance? Because it is also, I'm struggling with that of course in the international sphere certain countries are very dominant, but I always try to find sort of alternative views and other perspectives, and I was wondering how you deal with that, or try to deal with that.
So for the period I have studied, you have some African countries from the British Empire, which appears like an alternative model in rehabilitation. So I take it into account. But effectively, there is the fact that you have very strong countries in the United Nations, in the WHO, in the ILO, and the countries of the South, a lot of time don't manage to impose their view on their proposal. So I think it's very difficult to draw a map of what happened at international level and taking into account all the proposals that could exist, but didn't manage to impose themselves on the international level, because you will have a lot of alternative possibilities. But you will have to search in a lot of national archive. What did this actor didn't have links with international level, and yeah, a lot of. So it's just the history of failure. It's very interesting, but it's much more difficult. But I'm trying to do this also.
Beth, I have a question about like just a fact, but then more what you think about it. So much of the concern for Canada, so much of Canada's concern over refugees was their perceived chance for economic productivity. But the Canadian Institute for the Blind was also involved. So I'm wondering, when they did allow in the number of disabled refugees that they did, was Canada alone really signing off on them being dependents, or had the Canadian Institute for the Blind basically agreed, we'll take care of them to a certain extent? So really the national health, not the term in Canada, but Canada Health, in a sense, wasn't the only one on the hook. And do you think that was significant?
So actually the only reason why these 10 individuals were allowed into the country was because the CNIB said, we will select these individuals to the best of our ability to ensure that they have some capacity to be economically independent. But if they prove not to be, don't worry, we'll take care of them. That was the stipulation. So yeah, like that, they're basically, the CNIB took it upon themselves, and that was what predicated the low numbers by which they accepted it in comparison to places like Norway, and actually later the US would accept many more as well. Yeah. So, and actually even Canada would later accept a number of refugees with illnesses like tuberculosis that had originally been completely denied entry as well due to health reasons. But yeah, at this time, it was very much the only reason why these people were allowed to come at all was because the CNIB advocated for them. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, really puts an extra challenge on the idea of enable citizenship, that, I mean, they could become citizens, but like the fact that you need a cosign, like your first apartment with your parents or something, is really underlines it. Thank you very much. Last, we're kind of getting on to time, but I mean, last questions from anyone? Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank our three speakers again for three excellent and one complete excellent presentation. And I guess we'll just do one final, I want to find out how to do this little, there it is. One final round of applause, everybody. And thanks very much. And yeah, take care, everyone. And we'll see you when anyone would like to come. I'm sorry, the date will be posted on our Twitter, our Facebook, and our website. But in just under a month, we've got our next disability futurity talk. Thank you again.